So there's a meme that shows up on social media every now and then it'll go away for a while, and it'll come back. And it's a photograph that was taken in a grocery store, kind of at the end of one of the aisles, over top of the shelves. And it's an oval sign that says water. So of course you expect to find bottled water and cans of spritzy water and all that kind of stuff under there. But instead, someone had filled the shelves with wine bottles. And so the caption under the photograph reads, "Jesus was here." So a story is rather well known from the scriptures if it can become a Facebook meme without explanation attached to it. Jesus was here. We read it that way because we've always thought about this story that we're about to read from John's 2nd chapter as the miracle of Jesus turning water into wine. And in some respects, it is indeed that story. And we think of it as the miracle of Jesus turning water into wine just to prove that he's really, really Jesus, so that you will be convinced and follow him. And to some extent, that is true. The last verse of our reading is going to say that the disciples saw this sign and saw Jesus' glory and believed. But I also want you to kind of hear this story a little differently this morning than just the amazing miracle of Jesus turning water into wine. And here's why. In this story, it's not really Jesus who does anything fabulous at any one moment. Jesus never puts his hand in the water. He never shouts an incantation, "Be thou wine," or anything like that. It's not Jesus. In fact, Jesus delegates all the work in this story to others. And another thing is that our storyteller never calls it a miracle. John tends to use the word sign, and there's a whole history behind that we'll talk about on another occasion, but never really refers to it as miracle. And here's the fascinating part, is that the apex of this story, the real gist of the story, comes from the mouth of what's called the chief steward. That's an interesting word. It's used once in the New Testament, here, in this story. And it literally is translated into the chief of the room with 3 couches. So, as you can imagine, we don't know how to translate it in a very effective way. Our translation will call him the chief steward. Others call him the master of ceremonies, or something like that. And it seems to be associated with a person whose job is to line up the entertainment and to make the festival festive. And it's the chief steward who has the great pronouncement in this story. And what's wonderful about that is he's the one guy in the whole story who has no idea that the wine was water in its origin. So I invite you to hear it not as the miracle story of Jesus turning water into wine, but perhaps as something else, as we listen for the Word of God from John chapter 2. We're reading verses 1 through 11. On the 3rd day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill up the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. Then he said to him, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. And when the steward had tasted the water that had become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This ends the reading. Thanks be to God. Will you pray with me? God of grace, as we hear the story anew, open our eyes that we might see what new thing you are bringing out of our cherished past. Amen. So as we hear the story, one of the first things we want to notice is that when Mary comes to Jesus with this loaded phrase, "They have no wine," which has the undercurrent implied in it, "Fix it." They have no wine. Fix it. When she comes to Jesus with that implication, Jesus' first response is to push back a little bit and say, "Woman, what has that got to do with you and me? My hour has not yet come." That's a rich phrase that we're going to have to bracket until another time, but it's a powerful phrase in John's Gospel. And then Mary, having heard Jesus push back a little bit, is undaunted. And she turns to the servants and says, "Do whatever he tells you." She's just like the epitome of the Jewish mother right here, right? They have no wine. We know what that means. There's a whole paragraph implied in that. And to the servants, do what he tells you, because she knows he's going to walk the line. She says to the servants, do what he tells you. Now I want to give the servants some props here, because it was very courageous what they did to hear Mary's command and follow Jesus' instructions. Because what Jesus tells them to do is to go over to these 6 stone water jars. These were jars that would be at a large celebration like this. They were for ritual cleansing, and they hold about 20 or 30 gallons each. So with 6 of them, we're talking about 120, 180 gallons of water. And since a marriage could last for days, they've been depleted somewhat with people doing all of the ritual washing that's done there. And the first thing Jesus says to the servants is, fill those jars. And while it takes us about 30 seconds to read the story, I'm reckoning it's going to take an hour and a half to walk to the water source and come back, and walk to the water source and come back, because they're too big to carry to the water source and bring back when they're full. And so there's a lot of work being done here by these servants. And they fill the jars to the brim. And then he says to them, second instruction, dip the pitcher and take it to the chief steward. Now, if one is a servant, you know that it's not your job to make the decisions. You're just doing what you're told. But you also know that if something goes awry, you're the one that's going to get blamed for it. So I'm really feeling a lot of props for these servants, for the work that they do here. Because they go to the stone water pitchers. And you never wash anything or stick your hands in there, because that's the clean water. You always take it out and do your washing somewhere else. And they dip out water. And they carry the water pitcher to the head table, where this chief of the room with 3 couches is sitting, this chief steward. And he's holding a wine goblet. And they're carrying a pitcher that they just filled with water. And they poured into his wine goblet. Because Jesus told them to do it, Mary told them to do whatever Jesus said. Now, they're between a rock and a hard place. You either disobey Mary, which is ill-advised, or you pour a pitcher that you dipped into the water into a goblet expecting wine. And this is an incredibly fraught moment. Because now, the chief steward takes a sip. And it could have gone badly. He could have taken a sip and spit it out and thrown the goblet across the room and stood up and said, "You invite me to your wedding. I travel a long way to be here with you today, and I invite these honored guests on my honor. I invite them to this guest for your wedding so that they can be fed and given wine. And this, you give me water. And the couple would have been not only scared out of their wits, but embarrassed in a way that just would have been a stink that follows them around for the rest of their life. Because this is a society that really values honor and disvalues shame. So I really appreciate what the servants are doing here, because they're following instructions. And they're pouring that pitcher that was dipped in water into a goblet from someone who's waiting for wine. And of course, the chief steward takes a sip and is delighted. Good for the servants. Now, what I love about these servants is this. Sometimes we're called to do the ridiculous, not because we know how it works, and not because we know that it'll be effective, and not because we know what's going on. These servants have no idea what's going on. They're following instructions because this is what Mary told them to do, is to do what Jesus said. And Jesus said, go dip water and pour it into a goblet expecting wine, and they do it. And it's ridiculous. It's almost as ridiculous as, I don't know, turning the other cheek and expecting that to be effective. It's almost as ridiculous as washing the feet of someone who's not really our better. It's almost as ridiculous as imagining that good can overcome evil and that a soft word can turn away wrath and that peace is better than war. These servants do as they're instructed, not because they know how the mechanism works, and not because they can fabricate some ethical reason why this is effective action, but in the midst of them doing as they're told, even that which they don't understand, something marvelous happens. It's a great story in that respect. And then listen to the words of the chief steward. He says, the line that many of you laughed at, everybody waits until they serve the good wine first, and they wait until everyone's good and drunk. And then when you get your crowd 3 sheets to the wind, you pull out the $2 chuck, right? You make sure everybody's taste buds have been deadened and their mind's happy and they don't really care what you pour in there, and that's when we get to the ripple. That's what we do. And he said, you've done something marvelous because you saved the best for last. I love those words because it's coming from someone who totally doesn't know what just happened. He just knows the effects of it. Because what just happened was that these servants walked over to these 6 stone water jars. These 6 gigantic jars full of water, which had all kinds of purposes to them. There were hygienic purposes where you would wash oneself, ritually cleanse oneself in order not to infect the whole. And they were there because of manners. If you had come a long and dusty trail and showed up at my place, I would take that pitcher into that water and I would be sure to provide a means to wash your feet so that you could be refreshed after your long trip. So there's hygiene here, there are good manners here. And of course, they're identified by the narrator as the water for the rites of ritual cleansing. Because it was more than just hygiene and it was more than just good manners. Those represent the faith that's built on the idea that when we come before a holy God, we need to be cleansed to present ourselves as servants. So what these 6 stone jars represent is their religious tradition. And you know how it is with religious tradition, right? It's very easy to look at it and say, oh, geez, that again? Those dumb old 6 stone jars. So we have Purell. We don't really need the 6 stone jars anymore. Or, I'm not washing people's feet. Come on, their feet. We don't need the 6-stone jars. We don't really need that for hygiene. We don't need them for manners. And we don't need them to come before God. We just kind of, close our eyes and say a prayer. Everything's fine. And it would be easy to look at those 6-stone jars as kind of these vestiges of a mythical religious past that doesn't really hold meaning anymore. It'd be easy to ignore. But Jesus has the servants go to this religious past and to draw from their religious past in order to pour something new into the world. You see how that works? This is the relic of the religious past. It'd be so easy to dismiss and say we're forward-looking people. We don't need that, please. But Jesus has the servants go straight to the past to draw from the nutrients, draw from the wealth that is there in order to bring something new into the world. And so the chief steward tastes the wine and says, this is amazing because the newer is better. This morning, at the very conclusion of this worship service, we're going to have a brief business meeting, our annual meeting. I'll give you instructions at that time how to escape, if that's the last thing you want to do with your life today. But I would welcome and encourage all of you to stay and be a part of that. Part of what we do in this meeting is we elect new elders and deacons for a 3-year term of service. And if you're one of the persons whose name is on that list, and you're sitting there thinking, I haven't the slightest clue how to be an elder or a deacon. How am I supposed to step into this role of leadership with this fine congregation? I don't know how to do this. I just want to tell you, neither did the servants. They had no clue what was going on there. And yet, they're the hands that are involved in the water becoming wine. It's not Jesus dipping his hands in the water. It's not Jesus pouring the wine. It's not Jesus saying magic thing. It's these servants who really don't get it, but they're willing. So if that's who you are this morning, I just want to invite you, take that step and trust that God is greater than your insecurities, and you will do well. Also, this morning, we're going to look at our financial record from last year. It's kind of good news. We're all happy to hear that. We'll look at our faith budget projection for this coming year. We'll talk a little bit about how we're situated. What we're doing is we're stepping into something new. And last week, following worship, Gary Collins and Mary Roberts presented to us a little story about St. Mark and the history that we had here and the kind of the values that we were led into embracing as we've gone along. And it was powerful and somewhat intimidating for someone like me to think, wow, I sure hope I just don't walk in here and mess this up, because this has been a wonderfully led congregation that has been developed in the mind of God for quite some time now. And yet, as I listen to this story, and as you listen to this story as someone who may have been here 52 years ago, may have been here when we first moved onto this campus 11 years ago, but absolutely are sitting here right now, as you listen to us step forward into the future, understand this is how God works. God will take the reservoir of the great things that were done in the past, and out of that create something new. And that new will be wonderful, and it will be satisfying, and it will be God's will. So my friends, as we stand here today, still at this fresh part of this new year, and as we look to the future of who we will be as a congregation in our community, let's go with faith. Even if we don't quite understand what's going on, even if we know it's a revered past and are somewhat intimidated by it, even if we doubt ourselves that we have what it takes, let us trust God that out of an esteemed past, God is doing something new and wonderful. Thanks be to God. Amen.